Welcome to Discover Before Sleep channel. Tonight, a lone wooden ship drifts across endless oceans, tossed by storms and waves that seem alive. To its sailors, the world is chaotic, unpredictable, even angry. But the Earth is silent. It spins, breathes, and balances itself with a precision older than time, indifferent to fear or prayer. Every current, every star, every pulse of the tides is part of a hidden, unstoppable mechanism. Tonight, we sail with the ship, witnessing the true power and rhythm of our planet. A world that has been alive, moving, and perfect for billions of years, long before we ever arrived. So, let's begin our journey. The void was not empty. It was a heavy, suffocating, expectant silence, a theater of cold debris and the screaming friction of kinetic energy. Before there was a sphere, there was a ghost of a shape, a localized fever in the dark. Dust, fine as the particulate of a dying star, began to feel the first pull of an inevitable law. It was the law of the center. There was no intent here, no grand design, only the relentless, indifferent math of mass-seeking mass. The Earth began as a violent agitation of silicate and iron, a swirling disk of wreckage that had forgotten its origin and was now obsessively focused on its own collision. The friction was the first voice. It was a low-pitched roar that vibrated through the vacuum, the sound of trillions of microscopic stones grinding against one another until the heat of their meeting turned them into liquid light. The young protagonist was a chaotic, molten heart, a sphere of white-hot slag spinning with a ferocity that defied the surrounding stillness. There was no atmosphere, only the outgassing of trapped minerals, a veil of sulfur and carbon that clung to the glowing surface like a shroud of steam. The Earth was not solid. It was a fluid nightmare, a churning sea of magma where the heavier elements, the iron and the nickel, began their long, slow descent toward the core. They sank through the lighter stone, a metallic rain falling through a furnace, creating a magnetic pulse that would one day guard the world, though for now, it was merely the byproduct of a settling fever. Time had no meaning in this era of impact. The sky was an endless bombardment of celestial refuse. Every collision was an infusion of energy, a staggering blow that kept the surface in a state of perpetual liquefaction. There was no up or down, only the radial pull of the center and the outward push of the heat. The Earth breathed in fire and exhaled light. It was a singular, massive organism of heat, unaware of the cold of space, entirely consumed by the agony of its own consolidation. The light it cast was a dull, angry crimson, illuminating the swirling dust clouds of the solar neighborhood, a lonely beacon of geological birth. The surface was a landscape of shifting shadows and incandescent rivers. Waves of molten basalt, miles high, rolled across the face of the world, driven by the tidal forces of a chaotic orbital dance. There were no mountains, for the crust was a fragile, glowing skin that tore open as soon as it formed, revealing the blinding intensity of the mantle beneath. The Earth was a prisoner of its own kinetic history, unable to cool, unable to rest. It was a churning cauldron where the very concept of solid was a distant, future dream. The heat was so profound that it warped the space around it, a shimmering haze of thermal radiation that reached out into the blackness like desperate fingers. In the depths of this molten belly, the pressure was beginning to craft the internal architecture of the world. The core was tightening, becoming a dense, crystalline engine of heat. Above it, the mantle moved in slow, convective loops, vast, glowing gears of stone that rose and fell over millennia. This was the first internal rhythm, the pulse of a machine that would run for billions of years. It was a slow-motion boiling, a vertical migration of heat that sought a way out, driving the surface into a state of constant, violent renewal. There was a terrible beauty in this indifference. The Earth did not care for the debris it consumed or the heat it generated. It was simply becoming. As the eons pressed forward, the bombardment began to thin. The sky, once crowded with the jagged shadows of wandering rocks, grew vast and dark. The impacts became less frequent, though no less cataclysmic when they arrived. Each strike was a momentary flare of impossible brightness, a scar of white heat that would take centuries to fade back into the general crimson glow of the planet. The Earth was beginning to win its battle for territory, sweeping its orbital path clean, gathering the last of the local matter into its growing bulk. It was becoming a master of its own gravity, a silent giant standing amidst the cooling wreckage of the early system. The first hint of a change was not a sound, but a subtle shift in the spectrum of the glow. The blinding whites and yellows of the earliest days began to settle into a deep, bruised purple and ochre. The skin of the world, the lithosphere, was attempting to freeze. It was a fragile, stuttering process. A thin film of darker rock would form, a floating island of stability on the magma sea, only to be swallowed again by a surge of heat from below or shattered by a stray rock from the blackness above. But the trend was toward the dark. The Earth was losing its heat to the insatiable hunger of space, radiating its birth fire away into the void. This cooling was not a gentle transition. It was a war between the internal furnace and the external frost. The atmosphere was a thick, toxic soup of steam and acid, a crushing weight that pressed down on the molten surface, preventing the oceans from ever being anything more than a gaseous ghost. The pressure at the surface was enough to crush bone, enough to liquefy air. Lightning, miles long and constant, arced between the sulfurous clouds and the glowing ground, the only light in a world that was slowly slipping into a permanent, clouded twilight. The Earth was a dark, steaming cauldron, a place of immense weight and hidden potential, waiting for the first drop of liquid to survive the descent from the heavens. There was a profound loneliness in this era. The planet was a solitary engine of physics, spinning in a darkened gallery. It had no witnesses, no names, and no purpose other than the fulfillment of its own gravity. It was a monument to the power of accumulation. The silence was now punctuated not just by the roar of the fire, but by the first cracks of solidifying stone, the sound of a planet's crust breaking under its own cooling tension. These were the first earthquakes, the groans of a body that was finally beginning to find its permanent shape. The Earth was no longer a fluid, it was becoming a vessel. The transition from a star-like brightness to a stony darkness was the first great labor of the world. It required a patience that spanned millions of years, a slow, deliberate shedding of energy. The Earth was learning the rhythm of the long wait. It was preparing its foundations, laying down the heavy metals, stabilizing the mantle, and thickening the crust. It was a foundation for a structure that had not yet been conceived, a stage being built in the dark. The fire was retreating inward, hiding in the deep places, leaving the surface to face the encroaching cold of the universe. This was the end of the beginning, the moment when the chaos of fire gave way to the slow, heavy gravity of stone. The planet sat in the gloom, a massive, dark sphere of cooling basalt and trapped steam. It was a world of shadows, where the only light came from the occasional spark of a volcano or the persistent flicker of global lightning. It was a heavy, pressurized tomb of potential. The heat was still there, lurking just beneath the thin, cracking skin, but the surface was finally tenuously solid. The Earth had found its form. It had achieved the sphere. It was now a singular entity, a closed system of heat and mass, ready to begin the long, slow process of the great cooling, where the ghost of water would finally find a place to rest. The era of the great rains began not with a storm, but with a subtle molecular surrender. For millions of years, the Earth had been wrapped in a suffocating veil of vapor, a thick, opaque atmosphere of steam, carbon, and acidic gases that held the planet's heat in a relentless grip. The surface was a dark, jagged landscape of cooling basalt, a world of black cinders and razor-sharp ridges. But as the planet's radiation continued to bleed away into the void, the upper reaches of the atmosphere finally crossed a silent threshold. The frantic, high-energy dance of water molecules slowed, their thermal agitation losing the war against the encroaching cold of space. The first droplets formed. These were not the gentle raindrops of a spring morning. They were heavy, boiling tears that fell into a world still radiating the heat of its birth. As the first clouds collapsed, the rain descended into a furnace. Long before the water could touch the ground, it was flashed back into steam, rising in violent vertical plumes that fed the storm above. This was a cycle of atmospheric agony that lasted for centuries. A sky that was trying to fall and a ground that refused to receive it. The Earth was locked in a thermal standoff, a chaotic feedback loop of rising steam and falling rain that turned the entire planet into a pressurized steam chamber. Eventually, the surface won. The constant upward rush of heat began to falter as the crust thickened and stabilized. The first liquid water finally touched the stone, hissing and spitting as it skittered across the black plains of basalt. It gathered in the low places, in the impact craters and the tectonic gashes, only to boil away again in a matter of hours. But the rain was relentless. It fell for 1,000 years, then 10,000, then 1,000,000. The atmosphere was emptying itself, pouring its massive reservoirs of vapor onto a cooling world. This was the baptism of the Earth, a global deluge that signaled the end of the age of fire. As the water accumulated, it began to change the very chemistry of the planet. The falling rain scrubbed the air, dissolving carbon dioxide and carrying it down into the primitive basins. The atmosphere, once a heavy yellow shroud, began to thin and clear. The first oceans were not blue. They were an olive green, iron-rich soup, acidic and turbulent, reacting with the fresh volcanic stone of the seabed. The Earth was now a world of two halves: the rising, jagged continents of granite and the deepening, heavy basins of water. The weight of these new oceans began to press down on the crust, the sheer mass of the water flexing the lithosphere, settling the planet into a more permanent, weighted geometry. The rhythm of the world changed. The frantic, explosive energy of the formation era gave way to the slow, gravitational pulse of the tides. Though the moon was a young, close companion, looming massive in the dark sky, its pull was a violent, constant tether. The early oceans did not merely lap at the shores. They surged across the landscape in colossal tides that reached miles inland, grinding the volcanic rock into the first sands. The Earth was learning the art of erosion. Water, the great sculptor, began to carve the features of the character we recognize today. It smoothed the jagged edges of the basalt, filled the deep gashes of the rift valleys, and began the long, slow transport of minerals from the heights to the depths. There was a profound sense of cooling peace in this era, though it was a peace born of immense pressure and darkness. Beneath the waves, the Earth's internal heat still pulsed. Along the volcanic ridges of the deep ocean floor, the crust was still thin, and the fires of the mantle bled through in black smokers and hydrothermal vents. Here, the planet was a chemist, mixing the minerals of the deep Earth with the cold water of the new oceans. This was the laboratory of the world, a place of total darkness, immense pressure, and chemical richness. The Earth was no longer just a cooling rock. It was a complex, layered system where the movement of water and the movement of stone were beginning to synchronize. The first sunbeams finally pierced the thinning clouds, striking the surface of the global ocean. The light did not reach the depths, but it illuminated the shallows, revealing a world that was settling into a long-term stability. The great rains had stopped, leaving behind an atmosphere that was still alien but no longer suffocating. The planet was a sphere of deep greens and dark grays, spinning with a heavy, wet momentum. The slow rhythms were the first oceanic currents, vast, slow-moving rivers within the sea, driven by the heat of the equator and the cold of the poles. The Earth had developed its circulatory system, a way to move energy across its vast surface, balancing itself, finding an equilibrium that had been impossible during the fires of its birth. The silence of the early world was now filled with the sound of the sea, a constant rhythmic breathing of waves against stone. It was a lonely sound, a sound that existed before there were ears to hear it. The earth was a solitary traveler in the dark, but it was no longer a chaotic one. It was a clockwork of water and stone, a machine of immense scale and quiet precision. The continents were starting to drift, floating on the plastic mantle below, beginning a billion-year dance of collision and separation. The world was alive with motion, but it was a motion so slow that to any observer it would have seemed like stillness. This was the Earth's true nature, a presence that moves in eons, a character that considers a million years to be a single, fleeting thought. As the oceans stabilized, the first sediments began to settle on the floor of the world. Layers of clay, silt, and chemical precipitates built up mile after mile, recording the history of the cooling planet. These layers were the first pages of the Earth's autobiography, written in the language of pressure and time. The planet was now a vessel of memory, storing the evidence of its own evolution in the deep, cold archives of the sea floor. The fire was not gone, but it was contained, a hidden engine that drove the surface but no longer dominated it. The Earth had found its balance, a delicate, enduring state of being that would persist through the deep time to come. The stillness was a lie. Beneath the vast, dark expanse of the primitive oceans and the silent, cooling plains of granite, the Earth was a theater of immense, invisible tension. The planet was no longer a frantic spray of molten debris, but it had become something perhaps more terrifying, a pressurized engine of slow-motion destruction and creation. The laws of the world were now written in the language of vectors, force, friction, and the relentless downward pull of mass. The crust, once a uniform skin, had begun to crack under the strain of the cooling interior, dividing into massive, jagged plates of stone that floated like frozen rafts upon the churning heat of the mantle. This was the birth of the Great Motion. Deep within the Earth, the heat was not a stagnant pool. It was a rising, falling tide of plastic rock. Plumes of hot mantle rose toward the surface, spreading out beneath the crust and pulling at the continents with the grip of 1,000 grapples. The stone did not break easily. It resisted with a stubborn, crystalline defiance, building up stress over centuries, storing energy in the silent bonds of the rock itself. And then, in a fraction of a second, the resistance would fail. The Earth would shudder, a soundless scream of snapping stone that rippled through the foundations of the world, thrusting mountains toward the sky and tearing the seafloor asunder. The mountains were not mere piles of rock. They were the Earth's scars, the evidence of its internal struggle. Where two plates met, the crust was forced upward, folded and crumpled like paper in the hand of a giant. These peaks rose into the thin, cold air, their summits untouched by the oceans, becoming the first barriers for the wandering winds. The wind, driven by the heat of a distant sun and the relentless rotation of the planet, found its path obstructed. It began to howl around the crags, carrying with it the invisible tools of erosion. The wind was a ghost with a chisel, peeling away the surface of the heights grain by grain, transporting the essence of the mountains back down toward the sea. Water, too, was an invisible force of architectural change. It was no longer just a static weight in the basins. It had become a circulating system of incredible power. Driven by the planet's spin, the oceans moved in great, sweeping gyres, vast circles of water that redistributed the heat of the world. Beneath the surface, deep water currents moved with the weight of entire continents, silent and unstoppable, carving canyons into the continental shelves that made the greatest mountain ranges look like foothills. The Earth was a machine of fluid dynamics, balancing its thermal budget through the movement of every single drop of water, ensuring that no part of the sphere remained in isolation. Gravity was the silent conductor of this symphony. It held the atmosphere in a tight, protective embrace, preventing the life-giving gases from leaking into the hungry vacuum of space. It governed the fall of every raindrop and the slide of every glacier. It was the force that kept the moon in its tethered orbit, a gravitational anchor that pulled the oceans back and forth in a ceaseless, rhythmic breathing. This lunar pull was more than just a tide. It was a rhythmic flexing of the Earth's very crust, a subtle distortion of the planet's shape that generated internal friction, keeping the core molten and the magnetic field alive. The Earth was not a static object. It was a vibrating, pulsating entity, held together by the invisible threads of its own mass. In the shadows of the deep valleys and the sun-bleached stretches of the first deserts, the silent laws were at work. Thermodynamics dictated the flow of energy from the hot interior to the cold exterior. Chemistry governed the slow transformation of basalt into clay, the leaching of salts from the stone into the sea, turning the world's water from fresh rain into the saline womb of the future. There was no haste in any of this. The Earth operated on a scale of time that rendered the fastest hurricane a momentary flicker. A mountain might take 10 million years to rise, and another 50 million to be ground back into the dust of the plains. The Earth was indifferent to the speed of change. It cared only for the persistence of the cycle. The motion of the planet was a clock of incredible complexity. The rotation was slowing, minutely, as the tidal friction acted as a brake on the spinning sphere. The tilt of the axis wobbled in a long, slow circle, a planetary nod that shifted the focus of the sun's heat over tens of thousands of years. These were the Milankovitch rhythms, the subtle shifts in the planet's orientation that would eventually dictate the coming and going of ice, the expansion and contraction of the deserts. The Earth was a master of the long game, a character that understood that balance is not a static state, but a constant, oscillating adjustment. Every grain of sand on the floor of the ocean was a testament to these forces. It had been part of a deep-seated magma chamber, then a soaring peak, then a particle carried by a river, and finally a sediment waiting to be swallowed back into the mantle through the great subduction zones at the edge of the sea. This was the great recycling. The Earth was eating itself, consuming its own crust to forge it anew in the fires of the deep. It was a closed loop of matter and energy, a self-sustaining system that required nothing from the outside but the light of the sun and the cold of the void. As the eons passed, the world became a landscape of profound, structured beauty. The continents, now thick and stable, moved with a majestic glacial pace across the surface. The oceans were deep and well-defined, their currents established in permanent tracks. The atmosphere was a layered shield, protecting the surface from the radiation of the cosmos. Everything was in place. The forces of gravity, friction, and heat had carved a masterpiece of equilibrium. The Earth sat in the silence of space, a blue and gray jewel of clockwork precision, spinning with a momentum that felt eternal. It was a world prepared, though it did not know for what. It was a stage set in the deep time, waiting for the first witness to appear on the horizon of its vast, indifferent oceans. The transition from the scale of mountains to the scale of a single, floating object occurred without the planet noticing. For millions of years, the horizon had been a clean, sharp line where the curve of the water met the curve of the sky, a boundary defined by optics and gravity. But then, a speck appeared. It was a minute splinter of organic matter, a fragile construction of cellulose and fiber, held together by iron nails and the desperate hope of a short-lived species. It was a wooden sailing ship. To the Earth, this vessel was less than a grain of sand on the back of a leviathan, yet it represented a new kind of presence, a witness that moved against the grain of the currents, driven by the capture of the wind. The ship sat atop the water, held aloft by the simple law of displacement. The Earth's density was the only reason the wood did not sink into the abyss. Beneath the hull, the water stretched down for miles, a dark, pressurized kingdom of silence where the light of the sun had never reached. The ship was a thin membrane between two worlds, the volatile, gaseous atmosphere and the heavy, liquid heart of the sea. It moved slowly, a white-winged insect crawling across a mirror. The wood creaked, a tiny, rhythmic sound of friction that was swallowed instantly by the immense roar of the open air. The ship did not belong to the ocean. It was merely tolerated by it. As the vessel moved, it left a wake, a fleeting silver scar on the surface of the water. To the men aboard, the wake was a sign of progress, a record of distance traveled. To the Earth, it was nothing. The molecular agitation of the water subsided seconds after the ship passed, the hydrogen bonds snapping back into place, the surface tension smoothing over the disturbance as if it had never occurred. The planet's memory was written in layers of stone and the movement of tectonic plates. It had no capacity to remember the passage of a wooden hull. The ship was a ghost, a flicker of motion in a world that measured time in the cooling of radioactive isotopes. The wind that filled the ship's sails was part of a global circulation system, a heat engine fueled by the temperature differential between the equator and the poles. The sailors called it a trade wind, naming it for their own narrow purposes, but to the planet, it was a necessary breath of atmospheric stabilization. The air moved because the Earth spun. The Coriolis effect twisted the wind into great, predictable arcs. The ship was simply a parasite of this motion, catching a microscopic fraction of the planet's kinetic energy to propel itself forward. It was a passenger on a conveyor belt of air that had been running since the atmosphere first cleared. Day and night passed over the ship with the mechanical certainty of the rotation. As the Earth turned its face away from the sun, the ship was plunged into a darkness so profound that the horizon vanished. In these hours, the only light came from the stars, distant furnaces that shared the ship's isolation, and the bioluminescence of the sea. Tiny organisms, agitated by the ship's passage, flared with a cold, chemical blue light. For a moment, the vessel seemed to be sailing through a galaxy of its own making. But this light, too, was a byproduct of the Earth's ancient chemistry, a spark of energy in a closed system that the ship was merely passing through. The ocean beneath the ship was not a static floor, but a moving, living landscape. Vast underwater mountains, the mid-ocean ridges, rose from the depths, their peaks still thousands of feet below the keel. These were the places where the Earth was still being born, where magma rose to create new seafloor, pushing the continents apart at the speed a fingernail grows. The ship sailed over these invisible birthplaces, unaware that the ground beneath it was expanding, that the very ocean it crossed was getting wider with every passing second. The scale of the movement was too grand for the witness to perceive. The ship lived in the world of the minute, while the Earth operated in the world of the monumental. Storms would occasionally find the ship, but these were not personal attacks. A hurricane was simply the Earth's way of shedding excess thermal energy, a violent redistribution of moisture and heat. To the ship, it was an existential crisis, a battle for survival against waves that rose like walls of moving lead. To the Earth, it was a minor atmospheric adjustment. The ship would pitch and roll, its timbers groaning under the weight of the water, a fragile box of air trying to remain buoyant in a world of crushing fluids. When the storm passed, the Earth remained unchanged, its currents still flowing, its rotation undisturbed. The ship was a survivor, but its survival was a matter of indifference to the forces that had tested it. Centuries began to bleed together. The ship was not one ship, but a lineage of them, a recurring motif of wood and canvas that appeared and disappeared across the centuries. The sailors changed, their languages shifted, and their maps grew more complex, but the relationship with the planet remained the same. The ship was always a guest of the elements. It relied on the Earth's consistency, the reliability of the North Star, the predictability of the currents, the stability of the gravity that kept the water in the basins. It was a witness to a perfection it could not truly comprehend, a tiny, fleeting observer of a system that had been functioning for 4 billion years before the first tree had even grown to provide the wood for its hull. The ship's presence highlighted the vastness of the Earth's solitude. In the middle of the Pacific or the Southern Ocean, the vessel was the only point of reference in 1,000 miles of blue. It was a reminder that the Earth is mostly water, mostly wilderness, mostly a place where humanity is an intruder. The ship moved with a quiet, persistent dignity, a testament to the bravery of the fragile, but it remained a speck. The Earth, the main character, continued its slow, heavy spin, its internal fires burning, its tectonic plates shifting, its oceans breathing with the tide. The witness was there, watching the waves, but the Earth was watching nothing. It was simply existing, a masterpiece of physics and time, moving through the void with a silence that the ship could never hope to match. The ship, suspended upon the surface of the world, was a prisoner of forces it could name but never truly feel. Beneath the keel, the Earth exerted a relentless, invisible authority that dictated every movement of the water and every breath of the air. This was the reign of gravity, not merely a word, but a crushing structural reality. It was the glue of the universe, the force that had gathered the dust of the solar system and forged it into this heavy, spinning sphere. To the men on the ship, gravity was simply the reason things fell. To the Earth, it was the very tension of its existence, the weight of quadrillions of tons of iron and stone pulling inward, creating a pressure that turned the core into a white-hot crystal. Because of this inward pull, the Earth was not a perfect sphere but an oblate spheroid, bulging at its equator like a spinning drop of oil. The ship, as it moved from the north toward the center of the world, was actually moving further from the planet's heart, climbing a gentle, invisible hill created by the Earth's own rotation. This spin, the centrifugal defiance of gravity, was the second great law. The planet moved at over 1,000 miles per hour at its belt. Yet the motion was so smooth, so massive, and so absolute that the ship felt as though it were standing still. Only the stars, sliding across the sky in their nightly procession, betrayed the truth. The world was an engine of kinetic energy, a massive flywheel spinning in the dark. The rotation did more than just cycle the light. It directed the fluids of the world. As the Earth turned, it dragged the oceans and the atmosphere with it, but they, being fluid, lagged behind. This lag, governed by the Coriolis effect, twisted the straight lines of the wind into the great spirals of the weather. The ship, trying to maintain a straight course, was constantly being nudged by the hidden hand of the planet's spin. The water beneath the hull was being pushed into vast, mounded hills of liquid, miles wide and only inches high, which the ship climbed and descended without ever knowing. These were the geostrophic currents, the result of the Earth's struggle to balance the outward push of its rotation against the inward pull of its mass. Deep below the ship, the unseen forces were even more profound. In the outer core, a river of liquid iron, hotter than the surface of the sun, was churning in a self-sustaining electrical storm. This motion, driven by the cooling of the inner core and the rotation of the planet, generated a magnetic field that reached out thousands of miles into space. The ship's needle, a tiny sliver of magnetized steel, trembled as it felt the pull of this deep, metallic heart. The sailors used the needle to find their way, but the magnetic field was not there for them. It was the Earth's shield, a shimmering invisible armor that deflected the solar wind and kept the atmosphere from being stripped away into the vacuum. The ship was sailing through a protective bubble generated by a subterranean fire it could never see. The oceans were not a flat expanse, but a complex topography of weight and density. The Earth's gravity was not uniform. In places where the crust was thicker or the mantle more dense, the pull was stronger, creating dips and swells in the sea level that had nothing to do with the wind. The ship moved through a landscape of gravitational mountains and valleys, its path dictated by the uneven distribution of the planet's ancient mass. The water was constantly seeking an equilibrium that was always shifting, driven by the melting of distant ice and the slow rising of continents relieved of their glacial burdens. The Earth was a fluid, living thing, its very shape responding to the movement of its internal organs. There was a profound precision to this hidden order. The Earth's rotation was a master clock, but it was a clock with many gears. The tides, driven by the moon, acted as a brake, minutely stretching the days over millions of years. This friction generated heat, a tiny fraction of which seeped through the seafloor, warming the bottom of the ocean and driving the deep-sea circulation. The ship was a witness to a system of total integration. Every force was connected. The heat of the core drove the magnetism protected the air moved the the water distributed the heat. It was a closed loop of cause and effect, an immense, indifferent machine that functioned with a silence that was more powerful than any storm. The ship, with its wooden ribs and canvas lungs, was a study in fragility when compared to these vectors of power. If the Earth's rotation were to falter by a fraction of a percent, the oceans would migrate toward the poles, swallowing the continents and leaving the equator a dry, mountainous scar. If the gravity were to weaken, the very air the sailors breathed would bleed into the void. The ship's existence was a permission granted by the stability of these laws. It was a tiny beneficiary of a planetary balance that had been fine-tuned over 4 billion years. The Earth did not hold the ship. The ship was simply caught in the intersection of cosmic forces that were too large to be felt, only to be observed in their effects. As the sun set once more, casting a long red shadow from the masts across the undulating sea, the invisible forces became even more apparent in their silence. The stars appeared, their positions fixed by the same gravity that held the ship. The moon rose, pulling the water in a bulge that the ship felt as a slow, rhythmic lifting. The needle in the binnacle pointed north, tethered to the iron heart miles below. The Earth was a world of invisible threads, a tapestry of motion and mass that required no effort to maintain. It was a character of immense, effortless strength, carrying its fragile passenger through the darkness of space with a precision that was both beautiful and terrifying. The ship moved on, a splinter on a giant's back, while the giant continued its billion-year meditation on the laws of motion. The ship entered a realm where the Earth ceased to be a silent foundation and became a roaring, kinetic mechanism. This was the theater of the great currents, the latitudes where the atmosphere and the ocean collaborated in a display of raw, circulatory power. To the witness, it appeared as a storm, a localized chaos of white water and shrieking air, but to the planet, it was the functioning of a vast heat exchange engine. The Earth was breathing. The mechanism began with the sun's relentless focus on the equator. Here, the water was heated until its molecules grew frantic, expanding and rising, creating a literal hill of warm water. This liquid mound, driven by the planet's rotation, began its slow, inevitable slide toward the poles. Beneath the wooden ship, the Gulf Stream and its sister currents moved with the volume of 1,000 Amazons, a warm, subterranean pulse that carried the tropical fire toward the frozen edges of the world. The ship was caught in this invisible conveyor belt, its speed over the ground increasing even as the wind died down. It was being carried by the Earth's own blood. As the vessel moved into the higher latitudes, the mechanism grew more violent. The roaring 40s and furious 50s were not mere weather patterns. They were the result of a planet that had no land masses at these degrees to break the momentum of the wind. The air, unhindered, accelerated to terminal velocities, dragging the surface of the sea with it until the waves reached the height of cathedrals. The ship was a splinter in a washing machine of planetary proportions. Each wave was a mountain of kinetic energy, a manifestation of the Earth's angular momentum being transferred from the spinning crust to the fluid skin. The water here was changing. As it lost its heat to the freezing air, it became saltier and denser. In a spectacular, silent display of gravity's authority, this cold, heavy water began to sink. Near the poles, trillion-ton columns of seawater plummeted from the surface to the abyss, falling through the dark like liquid stone. This was the downwelling, the heavy piston stroke of the global engine. This sinking water pushed the deep currents along the very bottom of the world, a slow-motion crawl that would take 1,000 years to complete a single circuit of the globe. The ship, tossed by the surface spray, was entirely oblivious to the fact that the ocean floor beneath it was a river of ice-cold brine returning to the equator to begin the cycle anew. The storms that battered the wooden hull were the exhaust of this machine. When the warm air of the tropics collided with the frigid breath of the poles, the atmosphere buckled. Cyclones formed great, spinning gears of clouds that mimicked the rotation of the planet itself. From the deck of the ship, the sky was a bruised, rotating ceiling of iron-gray vapor. Lightning flickered within the walls of the clouds, the Earth's way of neutralizing the static tension built up by the friction of moving air masses. The ship was a tiny conductor in this electrical field, a witness to the planet's constant struggle to find an equilibrium that the sun was constantly disrupting. This was the Earth as a living machine, a system of fluid dynamics so complex that no human map could fully capture it. The ship was a part of the friction, a microscopic obstacle in the path of a global flow. The wood of the hull absorbed the vibrations of the deep water, transmitting the hum of the currents to the men within. They felt the Earth's power as a threat, but the planet felt it as a function. The Earth was not trying to destroy the ship. It was simply moving its mass. It was adjusting its density, balancing its temperatures, and shedding its energy. There was a terrifying precision in the way the waves broke. Each crest was the result of a 1,000-mile fetch, a calculation of wind duration, water depth, and gravitational pull. The Earth never missed a beat in this rhythm. Even in the height of the most ferocious gale, the planet remained a closed system of perfect accountability. Every drop of spray that flew over the ship's mast would eventually find its way back to the sea, and every erg of energy expended by the wind would be accounted for in the cooling of the water. As the ship emerged from the heart of a storm, battered and salt-crusted, it found itself in a moment of eerie, mechanical calm. The clouds parted to reveal the moon, which continued to pull at the Earth's skin, creating the tidal bulge that acted as a rhythmic break on the planet's spin. The ship rose and fell on a swell that was 1,000 miles long, the heartbeat of the world. The Earth, the main character, was at work, its gears of water and cogs of air turning with a majestic, indifferent grace. The witness had seen the fury of the machine, but the machine was only halfway through its cycle, indifferent to the exhaustion of the wood or the terror of the men. The ship had become a sanctuary of superstition, a tiny, floating island of human anxiety, adrift in a world of physical absolutes. Within its wooden walls, the men lived in a state of constant, trembling interpretation. To them, the Earth was not a mechanism, but a fickle and vengeful presence. They looked at the horizon and saw omens. They looked at the deep and saw monsters. When the sea turned a specific, bruised shade of indigo before a gale, they did not see the refraction of light through high-density particulates. They saw the anger of a hidden face. This was the era of the great misunderstanding, where the witness began to project its own fragility onto the giant that carried it. The Earth remained unmoved by this theater of fear. As the ship crested a massive, slow-rolling swell in the dead of a windless night, the sailors stared into the water, terrified by the burning of the sea. They saw ghosts in the bioluminescence, spirals of cold, green fire that trailed the rudder like the spirits of the drowned. They whispered prayers to a void that did not listen. Below them, the reality was a silent, chemical reaction. Billions of single-celled organisms evolved over eons to respond to the agitation of the water by shedding light. It was a defense mechanism, a microscopic spark in the dark, as indifferent to the sailors' prayers as the stone of the seafloor was to their anchors. The Earth was not haunted. It was merely radiant with the energy of its own ancient processes. Fear was the only language humanity could find to describe the planet's scale. When the ship sailed through the doldrums, the belt of low pressure near the equator where the air stagnates and the water becomes a mirror of hot lead, the sailors felt a spiritual dread. They felt abandoned by the world. They did not understand that they were caught in the Hadley cell, the great atmospheric loop where warm air, having risen at the equator, had left a vacuum of motion behind. The Earth was not punishing them with stillness. It was simply moving its atmosphere in a vertical circle rather than a horizontal one. The heat that baked the deck was the same heat that drove the hurricanes of the north. It was all one system, a single breath of the planet, but to the witness, it felt like a personal malice. The ship's charts were filled with terrors. They marked the edges of the world with dragons and whirlpools, names for things they could not measure. They feared the great abyss, where the water supposedly fell off the edge of the world, unaware that the Earth was a closed, curved loop, held together by the inescapable grip of its own gravity. They feared the magnets of the North would pull the nails from their ship, a misunderstanding of the subtle, protective field generated by the spinning iron heart of the world. Their awe was genuine, but it was misplaced. They were in awe of the shadow, never the light. They feared the storm, but never the incredible silent physics that allowed the storm to exist. As the centuries wore on, the ship became a repository of these errors. The wood grew old, was replaced, and grew old again, while the stories of the planet's moods deepened. The Earth was viewed as a creature of whims. When a volcanic island breached the surface in a fountain of steam and black glass, the sailors fled, believing the world was breaking apart. They did not see the slow, majestic rising of a mantle plume, the Earth's way of venting its internal pressure and creating new land. They saw the end of days. The Earth was merely performing its routine maintenance, recycling its crust in the long, slow rhythm of its tectonic life. There was a profound irony in this human terror. The very forces the sailors feared, the crushing weight of the sea, the screaming friction of the wind, the unpredictable fire of the volcanoes, were the same forces that kept the planet habitable. Without the tectonic fire, the atmosphere would have thinned and vanished. Without the violent currents, the oceans would have become stagnant, toxic pools. The Earth's power was not a weapon. It was its metabolism. The planet was a high-energy system, a roaring furnace of life-giving physics, and the ship was a moth fluttering near the flame, mistaking the heat for hatred. The witness remained a stranger in a land it had occupied for thousands of years. From the deck of the ship, the horizon was a mystery, a line beyond which anything could happen. To the Earth, there was no horizon, only the continuous, unbroken curve of its own body. The planet felt the ship as a minute irritation, a fleck of dust on a lens, while the people on the ship felt the planet as an overwhelming, chaotic god. They stood on the deck, clutching the rigging as the world tilted under a swell, convinced they were the center of a grand drama. They did not realize that the Earth's drama was much older, much slower, and entirely devoid of human meaning. It was a drama of stone becoming sand, of sand becoming stone, and of a blue world spinning in a silent, mathematical grace. The misunderstanding reached its peak in the silence of the great fogs. When the ship was wrapped in a cold, white dampness that muffled the sound of the waves, the sailors felt as though they had slipped out of reality itself. They believed the world had forgotten them. But the fog was just a meeting of temperatures, a kiss between a warm current and a cold wind, a transfer of moisture dictated by the laws of thermodynamics. The Earth was perfectly aware of where the ship was. The ship was exactly where the vectors of wind and current had placed it. There was no forgetting in a world governed by gravity. The Earth was a ledger of perfect balances, where every action had an equal and opposite reaction, leaving no room for the ghosts the sailors so desperately feared. The transition from fear to comprehension did not arrive with a scream, but with the scratching of a quill on parchment. Over the passing of many lives, the witness aboard the wooden ship began to stop looking for faces in the clouds and started looking for patterns. The terror of the unknown was slowly replaced by the cold, exhilarating weight of data. They began to realize that the ship did not move by the whim of a deity, but by the dictates of a monumental, clock-like precision. The Earth, in its immense and silent indifference, had finally been caught in the act of being consistent. The first realization was the regularity of the stars. The sailors noticed that the celestial vault was not a chaotic scattering of light, but a fixed grid, a map of the universe that the Earth rotated beneath with the accuracy of a Swiss mechanism. By measuring the angle of a star against the horizon, they were measuring the Earth's own curvature. The planet was a giant geometer, a sphere whose dimensions could be calculated by the shadows it cast and the light it received. The ship was no longer lost. It was a point on a coordinate system, held in place by the geometry of the world. Then came the understanding of the deep pulse. They began to chart the tides, noticing that the water rose and fell not in an angry surge, but in a predictable oscillation tied to the lunar cycle. It was a rhythmic breathing. The Earth was reacting to the moon's gravity with mathematical certainty, a tug-of-war between two masses that had been dancing for billions of years. This was not magic. It was the law of inverse squares. The sailors began to predict the water's height months in advance, realizing that the ocean followed a schedule that was never late. The Earth was a prisoner of its own physics, moving with a reliability that made human clocks look erratic. Beneath the ship, the currents were mapped. What was once a river of the damned became the North Atlantic Gyre. They realized that the heat was moving in circles, driven by the planet's spin and the placement of the continents. They saw the hidden order in the way the winds died at the equator and screamed at the poles. It was a closed thermal loop. The Earth was a heat engine, transforming sunlight into motion, and every storm was merely a valve releasing pressure to maintain the global average. The realization was profound. The planet was not trying to destroy them. It was simply trying to balance itself. The ship itself became an instrument of this new clarity. Its very movement was a calculation of the Earth's friction and the air's density. The sailors stopped seeing the fog as a ghost and started seeing it as a dew point, a predictable result of moisture and temperature. They began to trust the Earth's consistency. They knew that if they sailed south, the stars would shift by a specific number of degrees. They knew that the trade winds would be there, exactly where the Coriolis effect dictated they must be. The world was shrinking, not in physical size, but in its ability to surprise. The mystery was being replaced by a majestic, interlocking complexity. This was the era of the mechanical planet. The witness saw the world as a vast, intricate clock, where the gears were made of basalt and the springs were made of gravity. The silent laws were being transcribed into equations. They realized that the Earth was a system of conservation, of mass, of energy, of momentum. Nothing was lost. The water that crashed against the hull was the same water that had cooled the first crust. The carbon in the wooden masts was the same carbon that had been exhaled by ancient volcanoes. The Earth was a closed ledger, a masterpiece of recycling that had been operating with zero waste since the beginning of time. There was a quiet dignity in this revelation. The fear that had defined humanity's relationship with the planet began to dissolve into a deep, intellectual awe. They saw that the Earth was powerful not because it was angry, but because it was inevitable. Its power lay in its persistence, the way it continued to spin, to pull, to heat, and to cool without a moment's hesitation. It was a character of absolute discipline. The ship moved through the water with a new kind of confidence, the confidence of an observer who finally understands the rules of the game. But the Earth remained indifferent to this new understanding. It did not care that its laws had been written down. It did not feel the triumph of the men who had finally mapped its currents. The internal fires continued to churn. The tectonic plates continued their inch-by-inch migration, and the magnetic field continued to flicker in the dark, all regardless of whether there was a witness to name them. The clockwork precision was not for the sake of the ship. It was simply the only way a planet could exist. The Earth was a silent protagonist, occupied with the immense task of maintaining its own equilibrium, moving through the eons with a grace that was as beautiful as it was unseeing. The ship had become a floating archive, its wood saturated with the salt of 100 years, and its cabins filled with the patient records of 1,000 voyages. The men who paced its decks were no longer mere survivors. They had become chroniclers of the deep. They had learned to read the Earth not as a collection of isolated events, but as a single, continuous sentence written in the language of cycles. They observed the way the sea surface temperature shifted by a fraction of a degree over decades, and how the migration of the fish followed the invisible, thermal borders of the great currents. This was the era of the Long Watch, where the cumulative memory of humanity finally began to match the slow, heavy heartbeat of the planet. Generations of sailors had passed the same landmarks. the jagged headlands of granite and the volcanic peaks that punctured the clouds. And in doing so, they noticed the subtle, impossible shifts. They saw that a harbor once deep was now shallowing as the land slowly rebounded from the weight of ancient, vanished ice. They recorded the retreat of glaciers in the far north, realizing that the Earth's thermostat was a delicate, shifting mechanism. The hidden order was revealing itself through the lens of time. They understood now that the Earth was a vast, interconnected web. A volcanic eruption in a distant southern sea could dim the sun in the north, chilling the winds and altering the path of the very ship they sailed upon. The ship was a witness to the planet's profound memory. The sailors pulled up core samples from the seabed, finding layers of ancient ash and microscopic shells that told the story of a world that had breathed in and out, heating and cooling, for millions of years before their kind existed. They realized that the now they lived in was merely a momentary flicker in a grander rhythm. The Earth was a master of the slow transition. It did not change its mind. It moved its mass. The continents were drifting at the speed of a growing hair, but over the generations of the ship's life, that movement added up to a measurable distance. The world was literally expanding and contracting beneath their feet. The silence of the Earth was no longer perceived as a void, but as a deep, resonant frequency. The witness began to hear the music of the spheres in the hum of the trade winds and the roar of the surf. There was a perfection in the way the saltiness of the sea was maintained by the balance of river runoff and underwater volcanism. There was a logic in the way the oxygen in the air was kept at a steady level by the churning of the green plankton in the sunlit layers of the ocean. The ship sailed through a masterpiece of biological and geological engineering, a system where every part supported the whole, and where the indifference of the planet was actually its greatest strength. It did not deviate from its laws for anyone. It remained a stable, predictable home. This realization brought a new kind of humility. The men on the ship looked at the vastness of the Atlantic or the Pacific and no longer felt small in a terrifying way, but small in a way that felt like belonging. They were part of the Earth's story, a tiny, self-aware fragment of the planet's own material, looking back at itself. The wooden ship, made of trees that had breathed the Earth's air and drunk its rain, was a piece of the planet that had been shaped by human hands to explore the planet's surface. The distinction between the witness and the hero vanished. The ship was the Earth observing the Earth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sailors could now calculate the exact second of its disappearance, accounting for the refraction of the atmosphere and the curvature of the world. They were no longer surprised by the moon's phase or the direction of the swell. The hidden order had become an open book. They saw the Earth as a grand, ancient system of balance, a world that had survived cataclysms and ice ages, always returning to its steady, spinning equilibrium. The planet moved with the quiet, clock-like precision of a machine that would never wear out, its gears lubricated by gravity and its engine fueled by the fading heat of its own creation. The Earth, the main character, continued its work. It did not pause to acknowledge the maps being drawn or the journals being filled. It continued to pump magma into the deep ridges, to swirl its clouds into white vortices, and to pull the moon across the sky. It was a character of immense, focused integrity. The ship was a witness to the fact that the world was not a stage but a process, a verb rather than a noun. The Earth was not a place where things happened. It was the happening itself. The ship moved on, a silent observer of a silent giant, as the generations of observation finally allowed the witness to see the planet as it truly was, an eternal, self-sustaining miracle of physics. The ship had at last become a part of the horizon it once chased. Its wood was no longer the vibrant, amber hue of a fallen forest, but a silvered, salt-worn gray, indistinguishable from the driftwood and the bleached shells of the deep. It moved now without the frantic urgency of discovery, settling instead into the long, slow glide of the planet's own momentum. The witness had reached the final understanding. The Earth was not a resource to be conquered, nor a monster to be tamed, but a closed and perfect loop. It was an eternal system of balance, a masterpiece of self-correction that had been refining its own symmetry for 4.5 billion years. As the vessel drifted through a sea so calm it seemed like a solid sheet of mercury, the reflection of the stars above met the reflection of the stars below. In this moment, the ship seemed suspended in a void, a tiny speck of consciousness held in the palm of a cosmic giant. The Earth's indifference was no longer felt as coldness, but as a profound, unwavering reliability. The planet did not need to love the ship to sustain it. It only needed to remain true to itself. It continued to exhale the oxygen the sailors breathed, to pull the tides that guided their path, and to generate the magnetic shield that spared them from the fires of the sun. It was a silent, effortless benevolence. The internal fires that had once birthed the world in a scream of magma were now tempered, a steady, subterranean hum that kept the continents in motion. The oceans, which had once fallen from a toxic sky in a million-year deluge, were now a stabilized reservoir of life and heat. The atmosphere, a delicate thinness of nitrogen and oxygen, was the Earth's final, poetic layer, a veil that softened the harsh light of the stars and held the warmth of the day against the chill of the night. Every element was in its place. The nitrogen, the carbon, the water, and the stone moved through their respective cycles with a grace that transcended the human concept of time. The Earth was a symphony of recycling, where nothing was ever truly lost, only transformed into a new state of being. In this final reflection, the witness saw that the Earth was the only true protagonist in the story. Humanity, represented by the lone, wooden ship, was a fleeting guest, a passenger on a journey whose beginning and end were written in the strata of the Earth. The ship would eventually succumb to the friction of the water and the hunger of the salt. Its timbers would sink to the lightless plains of the abyss, becoming part of the sediment, eventually to be swallowed by a subduction zone and melted back into the mantle. The Earth would take the ship back. It would reclaim the iron and the carbon, returning them to the great furnace to be forged into something else, perhaps a new mountain range or a different sea. There was no death in this system, only the persistence of the cycle. The planet stood in the blackness of space, a vibrant, glowing anomaly of blue and white. It was a character that had survived the violence of its birth and the long, cold struggle of its development to reach this state of exquisite, clockwork equilibrium. It moved with a quiet, majestic indifference to the civilizations that rose and fell upon its skin, occupied with the larger work of maintaining the conditions for existence itself. It was the great sustainer, the silent lawgiver, the eternal engine. As the ship finally vanished into the haze of a distant dawn, the Earth remained. It continued its heavy, rhythmic spin, a solitary dancer in the gallery of the solar system. The winds continued to swirl in their predictable gyres. The currents continued to move the heat of the tropics to the ice of the poles. The core continued to spin its golden web of magnetism. The story of the Earth did not end with the witness, for the witness was merely a footnote in a biography of eons. The planet was a system of balance that required no applause, a miracle of physics that functioned in the dark, a home that asked for nothing and provided everything. It was, and would always be, a masterpiece of time, moving through the silence of the universe with a power and a peace that surpassed all understanding.